Hello, lovely people. It's good to have you here tonight. I want you to picture something for me. You're 12 years old. You're standing in a room that smells of ink and tallow candles. Your father is sitting at a table across from a man you've never met. They're talking about land. They're talking about livestock. They're talking about money. And every now and then one of them glances at you, not with cruelty, not with malice, with something worse, practicality. You're the subject of this conversation, but nobody has asked your opinion. Nobody will. Because in this room, in this century, you're not a person with preferences and fears, not someone with a favourite spot by the fire. You are a contract waiting to be signed, and right there, on the table between them, is a piece of folded parchment, a marriage contract. Your father's hand rests on it, perfectly still. He hasn't signed it yet, but he will. Most people think medieval child marriage happened because the world was cruel and nobody knew any better, that it was a dark age, and dark things happened, and there's nothing more to say. But that's not quite right. The church actually tried to stop it. They wrote rules. They demanded consent. They set a minimum age, and families broke every one of those rules, not out of ignorance, but out of strategy. Because a daughter, in the medieval world, wasn't just a child. She was the most valuable negotiating tool a family would ever own. Tonight, we're going to walk through that world together, and I think what surprises you most won't be how different it was from ours. It'll be how logical it all sounded, from the inside. Before we go any further, I want to tell you something. Late at night, after everything's been recorded and edited, I sit there reading comments. It's become a habit I can't explain. The ones that stay with me are always the ones with a place and a time in them. Someone lying in bed at midnight in Toronto. Someone on a couch in Melbourne at 3 a.m. It turns this whole thing from a video into something that feels more like company. So tell me, where are you right now and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. And if this kind of storytelling helps you wind down, it would genuinely mean a lot if you subscribed and left a like. And if you're new here, welcome. What we do on this channel is simple. We go somewhere old, we take the history seriously, we don't look away from the uncomfortable parts, and then we find our way back to wherever you're lying or sitting or resting right now. It's a kind of time travel that ends where you started, in a warm room, in the present, a little fuller than you were before. Tonight, we're going deep, 600 years deep, into a world that looked at little girls and saw contracts, but also into a world that produced some of the most remarkable women in history. Women who played the game with the cards that were dealt to them, and sometimes, against every expectation, won. Now, dim those lights if you can. Let the room go quiet. Let everything else, the day, the noise, whatever's been sitting on your shoulders, let it go. We're going somewhere old tonight. Somewhere that smells of parchment and cold stone and candle wax, and I think you'll find it stranger than you expect, and more human than you imagined. There is something most people get wrong about the Middle Ages and marriage. They assume there were no rules, that it was a lawless free-for-all where fathers sold daughters and nobody questioned it. And I understand why you'd think that. It's the version of a history that shows up in documentaries, in novels, in late-night conversations about how terrible things used to be. People think of the medieval world as a place without structure, without law, without any of the protections that we take for granted. But it isn't true. There were rules, detailed ones, written by monks, debated by scholars, argued over in universities and church courts across Europe, and enforced, sometimes, by the church itself. And the strange thing is, Those rules were trying to protect you. To understand this, you need to understand something about how medieval Europe thought about law. There were two legal systems running side by side, like two rivers, that occasionally merged and occasionally collided. There was secular law, the law of kings and lords, of feudal obligation and inheritance. And there was canon law, the law of the church, and in medieval Europe, canon law was arguably the more powerful of the two. It reached into every corner of the life that secular law couldn't touch: birth, marriage, death, baptism, confession, absolution, the soul itself. Marriage belonged to the church, completely, exclusively, without dispute. Around the year 1140, a monk named Gratian compiled one of the most important legal documents in medieval Europe. It's called the Decretum, formerly the Concordia Discordantium Canonum, which translates roughly as the harmonization of discordant canons. You've probably never heard of it, and that's fair. It's not exactly what you'd call gripping bedtime reading, but if you were a girl in the 12th century, this document shaped your entire life. Gratian was working in Bologna in northern Italy. The church, at that time, was trying to create order out of several centuries of contradictory rulings, overlapping traditions and regional customs that varied wildly from diocese to diocese. He didn't write new law. He compiled existing church teaching, organized it, and created a coherent system from what had previously been chaos. The Decretum became the foundational text of canon law for the rest of the Middle Ages, and buried in its pages was a set of rules about marriage that, in the context of the 12th century, were genuinely remarkable. The first rule was the age rule. A girl could not marry before the age of 12. A boy could not marry before 14. These weren't suggestions. They were canon law. In a world where the church controlled the sacrament of marriage, where a wedding was not legally valid unless it was sanctioned by the church, canon law was the closest thing to a constitution that most people would ever encounter. 12, that was the line. And the reason behind it was rooted in the church's understanding of the body. 12 was considered the age at which a girl was presumed to have reached puberty. Not proven, presumed. The canon lawyers weren't medical doctors. They were working with the best understanding available in the 12th century, which drew on ancient Greek and Roman medical theory and held that 12 represented the general threshold of physical maturity in girls. By modern standards, that reasoning is deeply flawed. Puberty varies enormously between individuals, and physical readiness for pregnancy is not the same thing as physical maturity. But in 1140, what Gratian was establishing was something new. The idea that there should be a minimum age at all. Before Gratian, there was no clear flaw. Families could, and did, arrange marriages for children of any age. We have records of betrothals involving toddlers. Children of 2 and 3 promised to each other in contracts, signed by their parents, while the children themselves played in the courtyard and understood nothing of what was being arranged on their behalf. The Decretum didn't end that practice, but it drew a legal line that hadn't existed before. Below 12, a girl could be betrothed, promised, but not married, and even that betrothal could be broken when she reached the age of consent. The second rule was the consent requirement, and this is the part that most people don't expect. Both parties had to agree, not their parents, not their lords, not the men negotiating across the table. The girl and the boy themselves standing at the altar had to speak their consent aloud. Gratian wrote clearly that a marriage without free consent was no marriage at all, a legal nullity, an empty ceremony. Without genuine agreement from both parties, the whole thing was void. In a world where daughters had no legal standing, no property rights, and no voice in public life, this was genuinely extraordinary. The Church, an institution that excluded women from the priesthood, insisted on female submission within marriage, and in most respects reinforced the subordination of women to men, was, through this rule, asserting that a woman's word mattered, that her yes meant something, that without it, the contract failed. It's worth taking a moment to understand why the Church built this requirement in at all. It wasn't sentiment. It wasn't that Gratian sat down in his monastery in Bologna and thought, you know, women deserve a say. Medieval canon lawyers were not proto-feminists. The theological reasoning behind the consent requirement was rooted in a very specific doctrine about the nature of the sacrament. Marriage, in Catholic theology, was not administered by the priest. It was administered by the couple themselves. The priest witnessed, the Church blessed. But the sacrament, the sacred thing, the mystery, was created by the mutual exchange of consent between the two people being married, which meant that the consent was not a formality. It was not a courtesy. It was the mechanism. Without it, the sacrament literally could not exist. This is why the words mattered so much. I take thee, spoken freely before witnesses, created something real in the eyes of the Church. And because the Church controlled marriage, and because marriage controlled property and children and social legitimacy, those spoken words were some of the most legally consequential words a person could say. The Church also had a practical problem that the consent doctrine addressed. Clandestine marriages, secret unions entered into without family knowledge or approval, sometimes between people of different social ranks, were extremely common in the medieval period. A couple who exchanged words of consent in a barn, with only each other as witnesses, had created a valid marriage under canon law, even if their families never knew about it, even if they would have been furious if they had. The Church kept trying to regulate this, to insist on public ceremonies and witnesses, but the sacramental logic of consent made it very difficult to simply invalidate secret marriages without undermining the entire doctrine. This is exactly the loophole that Margery Paston would use, 6 centuries after Gratian wrote his Decretum. She hadn't read it. She had no access to a law library. But the Church's logic had filtered down through the centuries, through priests and bishops and common knowledge, and she used it with the precision of someone who understood intuitively what it was for. You are protected, said the law. Your consent is required. Your voice is the sacrament. You just have to be in a position to use it. The problem, of course, was enforcement. A church court could, in theory, hear a case where a woman claimed she had been forced into marriage without her consent. And some did. The records of medieval ecclesiastical courts, bishops' registers, consistory court rolls, the surviving archives of church administration, contain cases of women appealing against marriages, claiming coercion, seeking annulments. These cases are fascinating. They're also rare. Because the barrier between having a legal right and being able to exercise it was for most medieval girls essentially impossible to cross. Picture it. You're 12 years old. You're standing at the church door, because that's where medieval vows were exchanged, outside, in the cold air, in front of the village. Your dress is your best. The morning is grey. The groom is standing beside you. He might be 25. He might be 40. He might be someone you've met twice. He might be someone you've never seen until this moment. Your father is behind you. Your mother is behind you. The families of both parties are gathered. The priest is asking whether you take this man freely and willingly. Everyone in that crowd knows what answer is expected. The entire social structure, your family's financial security, your own future housing, the political alliance that this marriage represents, depends on one syllable. Yes, the law gives you the right to say no, but the law is a piece of parchment in a bishop's archive, and you are 12 years old, and the world around you has been preparing you to say yes. Since you could walk, you say yes, and the church records it as consent freely given. There were women who went to the church courts. It's worth being honest about that. The medieval ecclesiastical court system, particularly the consistory courts that operated in every English diocese, did hear marriage disputes. You can still read some of them. The York Consistory Court records from the 13th and 14th centuries contain hundreds of cases in which women, and men, came before a judge to dispute a marriage, to claim it had been coerced, to argue that the words spoken at the door had not been freely given. Some of these women won. The courts were not simply rubber stamps. A judge who found compelling evidence of coercion could and sometimes did dissolve a marriage, or rule that a betrothal was invalid. The consent doctrine had teeth, occasionally. But look at who actually came to these courts. The cases that survive disproportionately involve women with some independent means. Widows who had the legal standing and financial resources to appear in court. Women in towns who had access to legal advice. Women whose families supported their claim rather than opposed it. The girls in the most vulnerable positions. The 12-year-olds being handed over by fathers who needed the match. The wardship girls whose guardians had arranged everything. Those girls are largely absent from the court records. Because reaching a court required resources. It required the ability to travel to a diocesan centre, often days' journey away. It required knowledge that the court existed and what claim to make before it. It required witnesses who would testify on your behalf rather than your family's, and it required a degree of courage that is very hard to sustain. When you are 12 years old and every adult around you is telling you that the marriage is right and proper and for your own good, the law gave you a right. The world made that right almost impossible to use. The age of 7. Age of 7. This is the third rule, and the one most people have simply never heard of. And it's the one that reveals more than anything else in the entire legal framework exactly how the system was designed to work against the girls it claimed to protect. Canon law recognized 7 as the age of reason, the age at which a child was considered capable of understanding the nature of a promise, not fully capable, not capable of making major life decisions or owning property, but capable of understanding that a promise had been made and that it carried obligations. And from the age of 7, a child could enter into a formal betrothal. A betrothal was not a marriage. It was a promise of future marriage. In Latin, the sponsalia de futuro. It was a ceremony usually held in front of witnesses. The couple, if you can call a 7-year-old and her intended husband a couple, would exchange words of promise. A priest might bless the agreement, and then both families would sit down and sign a contract. This contract was legally binding. It wasn't a handshake, it was a document with financial penalties attached. If a family backed out, they could owe the other family substantial compensation. If the girl reached 12 and tried to refuse the marriage her betrothal had promised, The legal and financial consequences could follow her for years. The freedom that canon law technically offered, the right to refuse at the moment of marriage, was systematically undermined by the betrothal contract signed 5 years earlier, and so the Church's careful system of minimum ages and consent requirements was navigated by the families of medieval Europe with impressive ingenuity. Betroth the girl at 7, negotiate the contract with teeth in it, financial teeth, legal teeth, and then, at 12, present the marriage as the fulfillment of something she'd already agreed to, something she had promised, something that it would be dishonest, dishonourable, and financially ruinous to refuse. The result was a system that, on paper, gave girls rights and protections, and in practice made those protections almost impossible to exercise. There is a particular kind of cruelty in that architecture, not the cruelty of malice. Most of the people who built and maintained this system didn't think of themselves as cruel. They thought they were being orderly, practical. They were managing the transfer of wealth and status across generations in a world where inheritance was everything, and daughters were the main mechanism by which two families could permanently bind their interests together. They were protecting their children as they understood protection. They were ensuring futures. They were doing what parents do, and they were doing it to girls who had no language to resist, no framework to say, "This is wrong," because the world around them had never offered one. There's something in that worth sitting with for a moment. Not the anger that comes easily from the distance of centuries. Something quieter, the recognition that a system doesn't have to be designed by villains to cause harm. It just has to be designed and followed without anyone stopping to ask the person most affected by it what she actually wanted. Nobody asked, and the silence where her answer should have been was filled instead by a father's hand on a folded contract. Ink on parchment, a transaction that smelled faintly of tallow candles. The law tried. It really did. It wrote the consent. It set the minimum age. It gave the girl a right. But it did not give her a world in which that right was possible to use. And the dowry is where everything becomes clearer, because the law tells you what the rules were, but it doesn't tell you why a father would sign his daughter away before she'd finished growing. For that, you need to follow the money. Here is something that changes the way you think about medieval daughters. In the eyes of a medieval father, a daughter was not a person to be raised. She was a debt to be settled. That sounds harsh. It is harsh, but it's also the economic reality that drove almost every child marriage in medieval Europe. And once you understand the math, the entire system starts to make a terrible kind of sense. The dowry. You've probably heard the word. You might vaguely know it means something the bride's family pays, but most people don't understand how crushing, how ruinous, how life-altering a dowry could actually be. Let me make it concrete. A dowry wasn't just money, it was a package. It included cash, certainly. Sometimes substantial amounts, sometimes modest ones, depending on the family's wealth and the groom's expectations. But it also included goods. And the goods were specific, enumerated, negotiated line by line. The trousseau, the collection of household goods, linens and personal items that a bride brought to her new household, was a core part of the dowry. It was practical. Sheets, tablecloths, napkins, pillowcases, blankets, cooking vessels, candle holders, items of clothing, jewellery if the family had it, chests to put it all in. The trousseau was, in effect, a starter kit for a household, everything the new wife would need to set up her domestic life. But it was also a statement. The quality of the trousseau communicated the family's status and seriousness. A bride who arrived in her new household with fine linens and good pewter and jewellery was a bride whose family had made a serious investment. A bride who arrived with little was a bride whose family couldn't, or wouldn't, meet the expectation. Inventories of dowries survive in the historical record. They're extraordinary documents. You can read through them and almost feel the weight of what's being counted. A chest of good woolen cloth, the product of months of spinning, rolled and packed and tied with cord, 6 pairs of sheets, 3 of them fine linen, a quantity that would have taken a woman most of a winter to produce. A silver cup, perhaps inherited, now being handed away. A brooch, a bed curtain of red wool. Each item was an argument, a statement to the groom's family that this bride came from people who could be taken seriously. The bride carried all of this to her new household, and when she arrived, it became her husband's. Every single item. By operation of coverture, the trousseau she had brought with her was now legally his. The father who signed the contract was a man who had spent, often, a significant portion of his wealth on the dowry. He had assembled the trousseau piece by piece, negotiated the cash component over months, and in many cases gone into debt to meet the terms. He did this not because he was indifferent to his daughter. He did it because, in the world he lived in, the dowry was his most meaningful act of parental love. Think about that. The most meaningful thing a medieval father could do for his daughter, the act that secured her future, her status, her protection, her household, was to hand her over to someone else's legal control along with everything she owned. That's not cruelty. It's not even thoughtlessness. It's a system that had taken the impulse to provide for a child and channeled it into a form that removed the child's autonomy as its mechanism. The father who loved his daughter most expressed that love by ensuring the dowry was generous enough that the groom's family would take good care of her. He had no other tool. The system didn't offer one. When your daughter married, your family didn't just hand her over. You handed over wealth, land sometimes, livestock, coins, household goods, linens, pewter, sometimes jewellery. The amount wasn't fixed. It was negotiated, haggled over, debated in letters that went back and forth for months. And the expectation was clear. The more prestigious the match, the higher the price. In some parts of medieval Europe, a daughter's dowry could consume the equivalent of 55 to 80% of what a son's inheritance would be. Let that settle for a moment. More than half of what your son would receive, gone in a single marriage negotiation. And if you had 2 daughters, or 3, or 4, the math became genuinely devastating. This is why some families sent their extra daughters to convents. Not out of piety, not because those girls felt a calling, because the family simply could not afford another dowry. A convent required a donation, but it was far less than a marriage settlement. The church got a nun, the family kept its land, and a girl who might have married instead spent her life behind convent walls. Which, as family planning goes, tells you everything you need to know about where daughters sat in the medieval priority list. Now, it hadn't always been this way. In the early Middle Ages, the system actually worked in reverse. The groom's family paid a bride price to the bride's family. You were, in effect, compensated for giving up your daughter. She had value, and the groom's family acknowledged it with payment. But by the 12th century, across much of Western Europe, that system flipped. The bride's family began paying the groom's family. Historians still debate exactly why this happened. Some point to the church's growing influence over marriage, making it a sacrament rather than a business deal. Some point to the increasing importance of land consolidation among the nobility. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. Daughters went from being an asset to being a cost, and this is where the story gets personal. Because the dowry wasn't just about money, it was about timing. It was about time. The earlier you married your daughter off, the earlier you settled the debt. The longer you waited, the more it cost, because you were feeding, clothing, and housing a girl who wasn't contributing to the household income. For a noble family with multiple daughters, the financial pressure to marry them young was enormous. Every year you delayed was another year of expense with no return. You might be lying in bed right now, thinking about how cold that sounds. And you're right, it is cold. But for a medieval father it wasn't cruelty, it was arithmetic. He wasn't selling his daughter because he didn't love her. He was settling her future because the longer he waited, the less future there would be, for her and for everyone else in the family. The dowry negotiation itself was a brutal piece of theatre. Families would audit each other's wealth before agreeing to anything. Letters would go back and forth for months. Offers would be made, rejected, revised. The bride's family would push for a smaller dowry. The groom's family would push for a larger one. And somewhere in the middle of all this bargaining there was a girl, 12, 13, 14 years old, whose entire life was being decided by men with ledgers. The Paston family of Norfolk, in 15th century England, left behind one of the most extraordinary collections of private letters in medieval history. Over 1,000 letters, spanning 3 generations, documenting everything from property disputes to harvest failures to, yes, marriage negotiations. And if you read those letters, you can feel the weight of what a daughter cost. In 1440, Agnes Paston wrote to her husband William about a potential match for their son John. She'd met the girl, a young woman named Margaret Mountby, and reported back with the efficiency of someone reviewing a business proposal. She noted that Margaret had made him gentle cheer. She advised her husband to buy the girl a gown. Every detail was practical. Every sentence was strategy. This was how marriages were built, not with romance, not with choice, with letters, calculations, and careful assessments of what each family brought to the table. The gown Agnes suggested wasn't a gift, it was an investment, and the amounts involved could be staggering. A noble family might negotiate a dowry that included entire estates, dozens of acres of farmland, buildings, livestock, and annual income from tenants. The bride's family would often need years to assemble the full payment. Some families went into debt. Some sold off ancestral land that had been in the family for generations, all for a single daughter's marriage. You can see, if you look at it through a medieval father's eyes, why marrying a girl at 12 made a kind of terrible sense. The sooner the contract was signed, the sooner the hemorrhaging stopped. Let me slow down for a moment and show you what that negotiation actually looked like. Because we tend to think of medieval marriage as a moment, a ceremony, a date on a calendar. But it wasn't a moment, it was a process. Sometimes a long, complicated, expensive, nerve-wracking process that could stretch across months or even years. And at the centre of it, often forgotten entirely in the paperwork, was a girl. The process began long before any formal proposal. It began with intelligence gathering. Wealthy families kept themselves informed about the matrimonial landscape the way a modern business person tracks a market. Who had daughters? What were they worth? What were their prospects? Was the family in good standing with the local lord? Were there rumours of debt? Did the father have a reputation for following through on his obligations? A family looking to marry off a son would assemble this information carefully, often through intermediaries. A trusted friend might visit another household and observe the daughter, reporting back on her appearance, her manner, her competence. Was she healthy? Did she seem capable of bearing children? Was she well behaved? Meaning, would she accept direction without making trouble? The appraisal was thorough, detailed, and conducted entirely without the girl's knowledge. You might have been sitting in a hall, working your embroidery, unaware that the man who'd come to visit your father was actually there to look at you, that his polite conversation with your mother was a quiet interview, that the way you moved through the room, refilling wine cups, was being noted, filed away, reported. You were the subject of an assessment you didn't know was happening, and if it went well, if the visitor went back and told the family that yes, the girl seemed healthy and agreeable, and came from a household that kept its finances in order, then the formal negotiations began. The formal negotiation was theatre, elaborate, tightly scripted theatre in which both families performed the roles of reluctant participants, trying their best to arrive at a fair arrangement. In reality, both sides came in knowing exactly what they wanted and exactly how far they would go. The opening offers were never the real offers. The first number the bride's family put on the table was always too low. The first number the groom's family demanded was always too high. And somewhere between those two positions, through letters, through intermediaries, through face-to-face meetings that might go on for days, the real number emerged. These weren't cold calculations in some smoke-filled back room. They happened in great halls and parlours and manor houses with fires burning and servants moving through with food and drink. The families might dine together, they might pray together, they might discuss the weather and the harvest and the state of the roads. All the while both sides were running numbers in their heads, and if you were the girl being negotiated over, well, you might not even be in the room. Or you might be seated at the edge of it doing your needlework, a quiet presence in a conversation that determined your entire future. Present, but unheard. Visible, but voiceless. Here's what most people don't understand about these negotiations. For the nobility, a marriage wasn't just about moving money. It was about building alliances, binding families, creating obligations. If the Duke of somewhere married his daughter to the Earl of somewhere else, the Earl's family was now obligated to support the Duke's interests. In times of war, and there were always times of war, that obligation could mean the difference between victory and defeat. A well-placed marriage could secure military support, trade access, political protection. It could neutralize an enemy or lock in a friend. Daughters were, in this system, diplomatic instruments, living treaties. The marriage contract wasn't just a financial document. It was a foreign policy document. It was a statement about which alliances a family was making and which ones it was willing to die for. This is why the highest status marriages involved the youngest brides. The more important the alliance, the more valuable the daughter, the less time her family could afford to wait. A French princess might be betrothed to an English prince before either of them could read. A duke's daughter might be married at 12 to a man 20 years her senior because the political moment required it, because waiting would mean losing the window, losing the alliance, losing everything the negotiation had built. The girl's preferences were not a factor. Her convenience was not a factor. Her age, beyond the bare legal minimum, was not a factor. The moment her father decided the match was advantageous, the timeline was set, and the girl's job was simply to arrive at the altar on the right day and say yes. That was the full extent of her role in her own marriage. I find it helps to sit with a specific image here. Imagine a room, a fire burning low in the hearth, two men at a table, your father and the father of the man you'll marry. Between them, papers, a candle. Why neither of them is drinking. They've been talking for hours. The numbers are close now. One more concession and the contract gets signed. You're not in the room. You're somewhere upstairs, perhaps, working by the light of a candle smaller than theirs, sewing, perhaps, or saying your prayers. The sounds from below are muffled. You can't make out the words. You only know that when they stop talking, your life will have been decided. And you wait, and the needle moves, and the candle burns lower, and eventually the voices stop. But here's something that changes everything you've just heard, and it's the part that most people miss entirely. Not everyone married young. The version of medieval marriage that most people carry around in their heads, the girl married off at 12, the groom she'd never met, the father with the contract. That was almost exclusively a noble story, a story of land and titles and political alliances. For the vast majority of medieval people, the peasants, the farmers, the craftsmen, the labourers who made up perhaps 90% of the population, marriage looked completely different. Peasant girls didn't marry at 12. They married in their 20s, sometimes their late 20s. And the reason is beautifully, painfully simple. They couldn't afford to marry any earlier. A peasant marriage didn't involve grand dowries or estate negotiations, but it did require something just as essential, the ability to set up a household. A couple needed land, or at least the means to rent it. They needed tools, animals, a place to live. And a girl couldn't contribute to that until she'd spent years working, brewing ale, baking bread, tending livestock, spinning wool. Every year of labour brought her closer to the point where marriage was economically possible. So the great irony of medieval marriage is this: the poorer you were, the more freedom you had. A peasant girl might never choose her husband freely. Her parents and her community still had opinions. But she was far more likely to marry someone close to her own age, someone she'd known since childhood, someone from the next village, and she was far more likely to be an adult when it happened. The noble girl married at 12 because her family had too much to lose. The peasant girl married at 20 because her family had too much to gain from her labour. Both were trapped by economics, but the cage looked very different. And there's one more thing about the peasant marriage that you might not expect. In many parts of medieval England, a peasant who wanted to marry had to pay a fee to their lord. It was called merchet, a tax on marriage. The lord's permission purchased with coin. If you didn't pay, you couldn't marry. Which means that even at the bottom of the social ladder, marriage wasn't free. It was a transaction. The only question was who was doing the buying. But between the nobility and the peasantry, between the girls married at 12 in castle halls and the girls working on farms until their 20s, there was a third world, one that rarely gets talked about in the broad brush narratives of medieval marriage. The world of the towns. Urban life in medieval England was different from both the noble estate and the village farm. Towns had guilds, organizations of craftsmen and tradespeople that regulated who could practice a particular trade, what standards they had to meet, and how they could run their businesses. And guilds had rules about women that don't fit neatly into either the noble or the peasant story. Picture yourself standing in the doorway of a baker's shop in 14th century London. The husband is dead, fever last winter, but the oven is still warm, the flour is in the sack. You know the work. You've been doing it beside him for 8 years, and the law in this particular town says you can keep going. The law had a word for what you were when you worked beside your husband, femme couvert, legally covered by his status, and it had another word for what you became when he was gone, femme sole, an independent trader operating in your own right, a widow who kept her late husband's bakery, his tanner's shop, his weaving business. She was a recognised economic actor in a way that most medieval women never were, and in some specific trades, textiles above all, women were not just participants. They were the core of the workforce. The wool and textile industry was, for much of the medieval period, the backbone of the English economy. England exported raw wool to Flanders and Italy, where it was woven into cloth. It imported finished cloth, and at every stage of the process, from the shearing of sheep to the spinning of thread to the weaving, dyeing, finishing and selling of cloth, women were present in enormous numbers. Spinning, as we've said, was women's work, but so was much of the weaving. Silk weaving, in particular, was dominated by women in London. Women who ran their own workshops, employed other women, and traded directly with merchants and wealthy buyers. These women operated businesses. They held contracts. They had legal standing as traders that most women in medieval England lacked. A young woman who came into London and apprenticed herself to a silk weaver was entering a world with more economic possibility than almost any other path available to her. She could learn a trade. She could earn her own income. She could eventually run her own workshop. She could, if she chose carefully, marry someone in the trade on more nearly equal terms than a noble girl handed over with a dowry. She was still constrained by the law, still subject to coverture once she married, still living in a world that did not offer her full equality. But her options were meaningfully broader. The guild records of medieval London are full of women. Names, contracts, apprenticeships, disputes. Women running businesses, training apprentices, suing in court in their capacity as traders. These women are not prominent in the popular imagination of medieval life. They don't appear in the stories about noble marriages and wardship systems. But they were there, and they were building something. The emergence of an urban middle class in England, from the 12th century onward, created spaces in which women could have economic identities that didn't depend entirely on their marital status. Not equality, not anything close to it, but something different from the absolute dependency of the noble girl who married at 12 and became, by operation of law, her husband's property. The medieval world was not monolithic. It was not one thing. It was a dozen different worlds existing simultaneously, each with its own rules and pressures and possibilities. The story of medieval marriage looks completely different depending on whether you're telling it from the perspective of a duke's daughter, a peasant's daughter, or a weaver's daughter in Cheapside. All three were women. All three lived in the same century, under the same laws, in the same country, and all three experienced the systems around them completely differently. That complexity doesn't excuse the system. It doesn't soften the edges of what a 12-year-old in a noble household experienced when she was handed to a stranger, but it does remind us that the past was as messy and various and full of contradiction as the present, that there was never one story, that there were always people at the edges, finding the gaps, carving out something that the rules hadn't quite anticipated. So far tonight we've talked about rules that tried to protect girls and failed. We've talked about money that turned daughters into debts. But there's a darker corner of this system that we haven't reached yet. A place where a girl didn't just lose her choice. She lost her legal existence entirely. What happened when your father died and left you an orphan? What happened when you were a child and you were rich, and there was no one left to negotiate on your behalf? The answer is the wardship system, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most cynical institutions in medieval English law. Here is how it worked. Under feudal law, all land technically belonged to the king. When a noble tenant died and left behind an heir who was still a child, under 21 for boys, under 14 for girls, the king gained something called wardship. This meant the king took control of the child's lands, the child's income, and the child's marriage. All of it. Everything. The king could manage those lands himself, pocketing the revenue. Or, and this is what usually happened, he could sell the wardship to someone else, the highest bidder, a courtier who wanted more land, a baron who wanted a strategic alliance, a man who wanted to marry his own son to a wealthy heiress. The child had no say. The child's family, whatever remained of it, had no say. The wardship was a commodity, bought and sold on the open market, and the marriage that came with it was part of the package. Imagine it. You're 11 years old. Your father has just died. You're grieving. You're frightened. And you've just inherited an estate that makes you one of the wealthiest children in the county. And within weeks, the king has sold your marriage to a man you've never met. Not your hand. Your marriage. The right to decide who you will spend your life with, packaged up and transferred like a piece of land. This wasn't unusual. This was the system. It was formalized, legal, and enormously profitable for the crown. Wardships were one of the king's most reliable sources of income. Children were, quite literally, revenue. And if the child refused, if the girl reached the age of consent and said no to the marriage her guardian had arranged, she owed a forfeit, a financial penalty, sometimes equal to the full value of the marriage itself. In other words, you could say no, but it would cost you everything you owned. The system was so lucrative that Henry VIII eventually created an entire government department to manage it. The Court of Wards and Liveries, established in 1540, existed for one purpose: to maximise the crown's income from orphaned heirs and heiresses. It wasn't abolished until 1660. That's over 100 years of formalised child selling run by the state. There's a moment, reading about the wardship system, where the scale of it stops being an abstraction and becomes something you can feel. These weren't hypothetical children. They were real girls, with names we've mostly forgotten, who woke up one morning as heiresses and went to bed that night as property. The guardians who purchased these wardships were supposed to protect the child's interests. In practice, many of them stripped the estates bare. They sold timber, drained fish ponds, let buildings fall into disrepair. They took everything they could before the child came of age, and then they married the child to their own son, or to whoever would pay the most, and walked away with the profit, which, as child protection systems go, makes you wonder what the word protection even meant. The practice had a vocabulary of its own that deserves some unpacking. The official legal phrase for the guardian's role was custos, keeper, and the ward, the child in question, had a specific legal status. She was a ward of court, a person technically under the protection of the law, practically under the control of whoever had paid the most for the privilege of controlling her. Think about what a wardship actually meant day to day. The guardian moved into management of the estate. He collected the rents from tenants. He managed the farmland, the livestock, the mills. He made decisions about the buildings, the servants, the obligations to the local lord. And all of this income, the income from lands that legally belonged to the child, went into the guardian's pocket, with a theoretical accounting obligation to the ward when she came of age. Whether that accounting ever happened was, historically speaking, a matter of optimism. Some guardians were scrupulous. They preserved the estates, held the income carefully, and made sure the ward received what was owed when she reached adulthood. These guardians existed. We have records of them. They are the exception that proves the rule. More often, the wardship was treated as a windfall. The estate was milked, timber was sold without replanting, fish ponds that provided food and income were emptied and left to silt. Buildings that needed repair were simply allowed to fall. The guardian's calculation was straightforward. The ward would come of age in 5 or 8 or 10 years, and by that time the estate's best assets would have already been converted to cash. Cash that was now somewhere else entirely. And through all of this, through the years of living in a household run by a stranger, eating food from lands her father had left her, wearing clothes purchased with money that was technically hers, the ward grew up. She learned the rhythms of a household that was not hers. She was expected to be grateful, obedient, adaptable, and she was expected to accept, when the time came, the marriage that her guardian had selected for her. Usually a marriage that served the guardian's interests, his son perhaps, his political ally. Someone who would make the transfer of the estate, when she came of age and it was returned to her management, as convenient as possible for everyone, except her. I want to be careful here not to paint this in purely modern terms. The people who ran this system didn't wake up every morning thinking about how to exploit children. They were operating within a framework that had been established over centuries, that had the sanction of both church and crown, and that was accepted as normal by virtually everyone participating in it. The guardian who stripped an estate and married off the ward to his son wasn't acting against his conscience. He was acting within the system's expectations, aggressively, perhaps greedily, but not illegally, not even especially unusually. That's the thing about systems. You don't need malice. You just need self-interest and a framework that rewards it. And children, particularly girl children, particularly wealthy ones, were the most valuable pieces on the board. There is something almost impressive about a system that managed to classify the guardianship of orphaned children as a form of crown revenue. Almost. The word you're probably thinking of is different. The English legal records of the medieval period are full of wardship transactions. Kings sold them casually, the way you might sell a license. A man named so-and-so purchased the wardship and marriage of such and such a daughter of the late Lord whatever for a sum of money. One line in a ledger, one entry in a royal accounting roll, a life. There were girls who pushed back, girls who made it to 14, the age at which female wards could theoretically exercise some agency over their marriages, and refused the match their guardian had arranged. These girls do appear in the records, usually in the form of the enormous fines they owed for the refusal. Fines that, in some cases, were larger than everything their family owned. The system made refusal financially catastrophic, which was, of course, the point. But not everyone moved through this system in silence. Not every girl accepted what was handed to her. And the medieval record, thin as it is, biased as it is, written almost entirely by men, still holds the voices of girls who pushed back. Before we meet them, though, there's something else you need to understand. Something about what happened to these girls in the years before the wedding. Because marriage at 12 didn't begin at 12. It began much, much earlier. It began the day you were sent away from home. You are 7 years old. You are standing in a courtyard you've never seen before, holding a bundle of clothes that your mother packed for you this morning. The stones beneath your feet are cold. The walls around you are high and grey and unfamiliar. There are people moving through doorways you haven't been through yet, speaking to each other in voices you don't recognise. And your mother is not here. She left an hour ago, maybe 2. You watched her from the gate until she disappeared around the bend in the road. She didn't turn around. You're not sure why. Maybe she couldn't. This is how it began for thousands of girls across medieval Europe. At the age of 7, the same age the Church called the Age of Reason, noble families sent their daughters to live in the households of other noble families, not as servants, not exactly as guests, as apprentices in the art of becoming a wife. The practice had a simple logic behind it. A girl needed to learn how to run a household, and the best way to learn was by living inside one. Not her own household, where she might be indulged or overlooked. Someone else's. A household where she would be watched, corrected, and measured against a standard she was expected to meet. And so you find yourself here, 7 years old, standing in a courtyard with your bundle, waiting for someone to tell you what to do. The first thing you learn is spinning. Not tomorrow, not next week, almost immediately. Spinning is the foundation of everything. Every household needs thread, for clothing, for mending, for trade. A girl who cannot spin is a girl who cannot contribute, and in this world, a girl who cannot contribute has no value. You're handed a spindle and a basket of raw wool. The wool smells of lanolin and damp. It's greasy between your fingers, and at first you can't make the spindle turn properly. It wobbles, drops, clatters against the stone floor. The older girls glance at you. Nobody laughs, but nobody helps either. You're expected to figure it out, and you do. Not today, maybe, but within weeks your fingers learn the motion: twist, pull, wind, twist, pull, wind. It becomes automatic, like breathing. After spinning comes weaving. After weaving comes sewing. After sewing comes embroidery. If your host family is wealthy enough to consider it a useful skill, each one builds on the last. Each one teaches you the same lesson, over and over. Patience, repetition, silence. But the domestic skills are only part of your education. There is another curriculum, invisible and far more important. It doesn't have a name. Nobody sits you down and teaches it to you in lessons. You absorb it the way you absorb cold, slowly, constantly, without noticing until it's already inside you. Obedience. That's the heart of it. Not just doing what you're told, but wanting to do what you're told. Learning to erase the gap between your will and someone else's instructions until the two become indistinguishable. A well-trained girl didn't just obey. She obeyed so naturally that obedience looked like choice. You learn how to enter a room without being noticed. You learn when to speak and, more importantly, when to be silent. You learn how to pour wine without spilling, how to serve food in the correct order, how to keep your eyes down when a lord is talking. You learn that your opinion is not required, and that having one is, in most circumstances, a disadvantage. You learn without anyone ever saying it directly that you are being shaped, smoothed, filed down into something useful. And somewhere in the middle of all this, you learn something genuinely surprising. You learn medicine, not the kind practiced by physicians. Those are men, trained at universities you'll never attend. You learn the domestic kind, herb gardens, poultices, remedies for fevers, for coughs, for burns. A good wife was expected to treat the minor illnesses and injuries of her household. She was the first line of defense against sickness. You learn which plants reduce swelling, You learn how to clean a wound with vinegar. You learn to prepare salves from beeswax and rendered fat and crushed herbs, whose names you memorize the way you memorize prayers. This is practical knowledge, passed from woman to woman across generations. None of it is written down. All of it is essential. By the time you're 10, you can spin, weave, sew, embroider, manage a kitchen inventory, treat a burn, dress a wound, and serve a meal to a table of 12 without making a single mistake. You can read a little. You can write a little. You know your prayers. You know which saints to pray to for which ailments. You know how to curtsy, how to walk, how to stand. You know how to make yourself invisible when that's what's needed, and how to be present when that's what's required. And you know, with a certainty that sits in your chest like a stone, that all of this is preparation. Everything you've learned, every skill you've been given, every correction you've absorbed, it all leads to one thing: a door, a church, a man you may or may not have met, a contract your father will sign, a life that has been decided for you by people who believe they're acting in your best interest. You are 12 now. The training is over. The girl who arrived at this household 5 years ago, clutching a bundle of clothes and watching her mother disappear down a road. That girl is gone. In her place is someone composed, capable, and quiet. Ready, that's the word they use. She's ready. But let's slow down here. Because ready is a word that tells you what the training produced. It doesn't tell you what those 5 years actually felt like. The first months were the hardest. This is not recorded anywhere. I want to be careful about what I'm telling you here. There are no diaries. There are almost no accounts written from inside the experience by the girls who lived it. What we have are fragments, references, occasional mentions in letters. But we can reason from those fragments, and from what we know about children, and about loss. A 7-year-old sent to a strange household would have been, in the privacy of her bed, frightened. She would have missed her mother with the specific physical intensity that children experience homesickness, not as an abstract emotional state, but as a bodily ache. She would have had to learn to hide it, because crying was not trained out of you with cruelty, but with expectation. The expectation that you were old enough to manage yourself, old enough to be here, old enough to understand why this was necessary, and slowly, over weeks and months, she would have. Children are adaptive in ways that are both astonishing and heartbreaking. The household became familiar, the faces became recognizable, the routines that had seemed arbitrary began to feel like structure. And structure, for a frightened child, is a form of comfort. She would have made something like friendships, other girls in the household, daughters of the family, other girls placed there for training. They learned together. They sat together through the long hours of spinning. They whispered at night in shared sleeping quarters. They shared small rebellions, the rolled eyes, the barely suppressed laughter when a pompous visiting lord said something absurd at dinner. They were in their way companions, and she would have discovered something she hadn't expected, that some of this she was good at. The spinning became satisfying once the motion came naturally. The herb garden was genuinely interesting. The smell of rosemary and thyme crushed between her fingers, the satisfaction of a poultice that actually drew out a splinter's infection. The estate management, learning to account for household supplies, to spot when the pantry had been pilfered, to negotiate with a cook who was trying to overcharge. This turned out to require real intelligence. Intelligence she had. She was good at this. And in a world that offered her few outlets for ambition, being good at something, anything, mattered. There might have been visits home, occasional trips, at Christmas time perhaps, or for a sibling's christening. and these visits had their own particular quality, because the girl who came home was not the girl who had left. Her parents saw the change. They saw the composure, the competence, the careful management of her own expressions. They were pleased. They should be pleased. This was exactly what they'd sent her away to become. But something had shifted. The house she'd grown up in felt slightly smaller. The parents who had seemed enormous felt slightly more human-sized. The routines that had felt like the whole world felt now, like just one way of doing things. She had grown up, partly from the training, partly from time, and partly from the specific kind of growing up that happens when you are separated from the people who love you and you have to figure out how to be okay without them. Ready. That's the word they use. They're not entirely wrong, but if you were a peasant girl, your preparation looked entirely different. There was no grand household, no noble host family, no curriculum of obedience and etiquette. Your training was the farm itself. You learned by doing what everyone around you did, working. From the moment you could carry a bucket, you were part of the household economy. You fed chickens, you milked goats, you gathered eggs in the grey light before sunrise. As you grew older, you brewed ale, one of the few trades that women dominated in the medieval village. You baked bread in a communal oven, measuring flour by feel because nobody had taught you numbers. You spun wool, just like the noble girl, but not as a decorative skill, as survival. The peasant girl's education was her body, what it could do, how much it could carry, how long it could work before it gave out. She didn't learn to curtsy, she didn't learn to pour wine, she learned to endure, and she married later, not at 12, not at 14, closer to 20, or even 22, because her family needed her labour more than they needed her marriage. Every year she stayed home was a year of income, a year of bread baked and ale brewed and wool spun. Her father might want her married eventually, but not yet. Not until the household could afford to lose her, There's something in that worth sitting with. The noble girl surrounded by wealth had less freedom than the peasant girl surrounded by poverty. The noble girl was trained to be given away. The peasant girl was kept because she was needed. Neither chose her path, but the shape of the cage was different. And then for both of them the day arrived, the day that everything had been building toward, the day the training ended and the reality began, the wedding day. You've seen weddings in films. You've seen the white dress, the flowers, the aisle, the music. You might even be imagining something like that now. Stone church, stained glass, maybe a choir. But a medieval wedding looked almost nothing like what you're picturing. For one thing, it didn't happen inside the church, not at first. The most important part of a medieval wedding, the exchange of vows, the moment that made the marriage legally binding, happened outside, at the church door, in front of witnesses in the open air where everyone could see and hear. The priest stood at the threshold, and the couple stood before him, and the vows were spoken there, under the sky. This wasn't a quirk. It was deliberate. Marriage was a public contract, and the church wanted it witnessed publicly. The door of the church was the most visible, most accessible spot in the village. Anyone passing by could see it happen. Anyone could later testify that it had. Only after the vows were exchanged did the couple move inside for the Mass. The sacred part came second. The legal part came first. There was music, usually. Not the organ music you might imagine from Hollywood. Medieval village churches didn't typically have organs. But there were musicians outside, pipes, drums, sometimes a fiddle. Music was part of the social occasion, the communal celebration that surrounded the legal ceremony, the way a frame surrounds a painting. And if we're going to be in this moment properly, let me put you there. Because the wedding day wasn't just a ceremony. It was a full, sensory, overwhelming day that began in the morning and didn't end until late into the night. You woke early. There was no wedding dress in the modern sense. White was not the wedding colour. That convention belongs to the 19th century and Queen Victoria. You wore your best dress, whatever colour that might be. If your family was wealthy, it was something fine. Wool or silk or velvet, dyed in a colour that would have cost real money. If your family was modest, it was still your best. The difference between a noble wedding and a peasant wedding was one of scale, not kind. Your hair would have been dressed. Loose hair, unbound, flowing, was the mark of a maiden. On your wedding day, your hair was likely braided or arranged, and you wore a garland or crown of flowers on your head. Flowers were everywhere at medieval weddings. Rosemary for remembrance. Roses where the season allowed. Greenery from the hedges. The scent of them mixing with the cold morning air, and the smell of the food already being prepared somewhere nearby. The whole village knew. In a medieval community, where most people lived within walking distance of everyone they'd ever known, where the church was the centre of public life, where news travelled by mouth before the day was out, a wedding was a community event. The families of both the bride and groom were there, but so were neighbours, so were tenants, so were people who had known the bride since she could walk. After the vows at the church door, after the mass inside, after the blessing of the rings and the formal prayers, came the feast, and the feast was the heart of it. Even modest medieval feasts were substantial by the standards of a world where food security was never guaranteed. For a wedding, families saved and prepared for weeks in advance. There would be bread, wheaten bread if the family was prosperous, maslin bread if they were more modest, but bread regardless, piled high on boards. There would be pottage, the thick savoury stew of vegetables and meat and grain that formed the basis of the medieval diet. If the family was wealthy, there would be roasted meat, pork perhaps, mutton. If you were very lucky, something exotic, game from the Lord's forest, fish from a nearby river or pond. There would be ale, always ale, the staple drink of medieval England, brewed by the housewives of the community, safer than water, present at every communal gathering. Wine if the family could afford it, honeyed wine, mead, for special occasions. And there would be sound, the musicians playing outside, the noise of a crowd eating and drinking and talking, laughter, toasts, the specific, insistent cheerfulness that communities generate when they're marking something, celebrating a transition, acknowledging a change, performing the rituals that say this matters. We noticed. We were here. We were. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, at the centre of the celebration, and yet somehow peripheral to it, was you, the bride, 12 years old, wearing your garland of flowers, sitting at the place of honour at the table, next to the man you'd just made vows to. The room is warm with the body heat of the crowd and the fire burning in the hearth. The smell of the food is everywhere. The ale cups are full. People you've known all your life are talking and laughing all around you. You are the reason everyone is here. You are, in the language of this day, a celebration. And you are also, quietly, terrified. Or perhaps not terrified. Perhaps you've been trained so thoroughly to suppress that particular feeling that what you feel instead is a kind of careful blankness. The composure you learned over 5 years in someone else's household. The ability to sit in a room and appear content, whatever you're actually feeling underneath. You eat, you drink, probably more carefully than the adults. You accept the toasts and the well-wishes and the nudges and the winks from older women who know what comes next and think you should know too. You smile at the right moments. You say the right things. You perform. Because performance, by this point in your life, is something you're very good at. The feast winds on for hours. The afternoon light thickens. The candles are lit. The musicians play something slower. The food is mostly finished. The ale has made the room warmer and louder and softer around the edges, and then someone stands up, and the noise begins to shift from celebration to something else, something more pointed, and you understand suddenly that the feast is over. The next part is beginning. And for a 12-year-old girl standing at that door, the distinction didn't matter. What mattered was the man beside her, possibly twice her age, possibly a stranger, and the words she was about to say. Words that would bind her for life. Words that the law said she had to speak freely, even though everyone behind her expected only one answer. The ceremony itself was brief. Vows, rings, a blessing. The priest might anoint the couple. He might say a prayer for fertility, because the entire purpose of this union, in the eyes of both the church and the family, was children, heirs, the next generation of contracts and alliances and negotiations. And then came the part that nobody talks about in polite company, the part that, if you're lying in bed right now, might make you pull the covers a little closer. The bedding ceremony. After the feast, and there was always a feast, even if modest, the guests escorted the newlywed couple to their chamber. Not discreetly, not privately, as a group, with noise, with laughter, with ribald jokes that the 12-year-old bride may or may not have understood. The priest came too. He blessed the bed. He prayed over the sheets. He asked God to grant the couple fertility. And then the attendants, family members, friends, sometimes servants, helped the couple undress and get into bed. This wasn't a violation of privacy. In the medieval mind, it was a legal necessity. Consummation was what made a marriage complete. Without it, the union could be annulled. And witnesses to the bedding, witnesses who could testify that the couple had been placed in bed together, were the insurance policy against future challenges. The curtains were drawn. The guests eventually left. And a 12-year-old girl was alone, in a bed that wasn't hers, in a house that wasn't hers, with a man she'd been handed to like a parcel. Did they always consummate immediately? No. There's evidence that in many cases, particularly when the bride was very young, consummation was delayed for months or even years. Families sometimes agreed to postpone it until the girl was older, until her body was more developed, until the risk was lower. The church, for its part, generally encouraged waiting, but not always, and the decision wasn't the girl's to make. What happened next, in the weeks and months that followed the ceremony, was often overlooked by everyone around her. The wedding was the event, the celebration, the fulfillment of the contract. What came after was simply life, and life, for a 12 or 13-year-old girl who just moved into a stranger's household as its nominal mistress, was complicated. The new wife was expected to take charge, immediately, not after an adjustment period, not after some weeks of observation, immediately. She was the lady of the house now, or at least if there was a mother-in-law, she was the second lady of the house, which was frequently its own political minefield. She was responsible for the household's daily management, for food stores and linen counts and the supervision of servants who were often older than she was, who had been in this house for years, who knew exactly where everything was and who had the authority to give them orders. She had been trained for this, of course. That was the whole point of the 5 years in the host household. She knew how to do these things, but knowing how and actually doing them in a strange place with unfamiliar servants next to a husband she was still learning to read, those are different experiences. Some girls adapted quickly. We see this in the household accounts and letters that survive, young wives managing estates with an efficiency that suggests genuine competence. Margaret Maltby Paston, who married John Paston I as a young woman, became one of the most capable household managers in the Paston letters record. Her letters are crisp, practical, detailed. She handled legal disputes, managed properties, and kept the Paston estate running during her husband's frequent absences in London. She was, by any measure, extraordinary. But Margaret Paston was also in her late teens or early 20s when she married, older than the very youngest brides. For a girl of 12 or 13, the adjustment was more severe. Some of these girls were taken far from home. An alliance between families in different parts of England, or different countries for the highest nobility, could mean a journey of many days, to a place where nobody knew her name, where the food was different, the dialect unfamiliar, the local saints invoked in prayers she hadn't grown up saying. She was expected to adapt to all of this while simultaneously managing a household and pleasing a husband. And the husband, he was often much older, 20 years older, 30 in some cases. Widowers who had already buried one wife and were looking for someone who could give them more children. These marriages had their own particular texture. The older husband often had established routines, established preferences, established loyalties among his servants and tenants. The young wife had to fit herself into a household that had existed before she arrived, that had, in many cases, already had a mistress. Another woman who had slept in this bed, sat at this table, given orders to these servants. She replaced someone, and that replacement was a role that required constant negotiation. Too much authority too soon, and the servants resented her. Too little, and she appeared weak. She had to be precisely firm enough, precisely gentle enough, precisely everything the household needed, while being 12 years old and far from home and learning the name of the cook. Younger husbands brought their own complications. A boy of 15 or 16, married to a girl of 12, was not much better equipped for married life than she was. They were children, navigating adult responsibilities, often with families watching every decision for signs of weakness or failure. The pressure on both parties was considerable, and the outlets for that pressure were limited. Some marriages developed over time into genuine partnerships. The record gives us glimpses, a letter where a husband writes to his wife with what reads like actual affection, a bequest in a will that leaves more to the wife than the minimum the law required, a joint signature on a document that suggests two people making a decision together. These marriages existed. Love wasn't unknown in the medieval world, but love, where it existed, was a bonus, not the foundation, not the reason. It was something that might grow or might not, inside an arrangement that had been made for entirely other reasons. You're lying somewhere warm right now. The covers are pulled up, the room is quiet, and hundreds of years ago a girl your age, or younger, was lying somewhere too. Not warm, not safe, not in a room she chose. There's no comfortable way to sit with that, and I don't think there should be. But here's the thing I keep coming back to when I read about this world. For all the contracts and the ledgers and the ceremonies designed to make a girl's silence look like agreement, the system didn't always win. Some girls said no, not many. Not most. The ones who did paid a price for it that makes you understand why the others stayed quiet. But they existed. They pushed back against a system that had been running for centuries in a world that offered almost no language for a woman's refusal. And the medieval record, biased, incomplete, written overwhelmingly by men, still kept their voices, faint sometimes, distorted, but there. And one of them was a girl from Norfolk named Margery Paston. You've already met the Paston family. You've seen Agnes Paston's letters, the careful negotiations, the business-like assessments of potential brides. The Pastons were a rising family, not nobility, not quite. They were gentry, wealthy enough to own significant land, ambitious enough to marry strategically, and meticulous enough to write everything down. 3 generations of Pastons documented their lives in letters that survived, by extraordinary luck, into the modern era. Margery was born around 1448. She was the daughter of John Paston I and his wife Margaret Mortby, the same Margaret that Agnes had assessed so efficiently in that 1440 letter. Margery grew up inside a family that understood marriage as a tool. She watched her brothers' matches being negotiated. She understood, from the time she could understand anything, that her marriage would be arranged to benefit the family's position. And then she fell in love with the wrong person. His name was Richard Carley. He was the family's bailiff, their estate manager. In the social hierarchy of 15th century England, a bailiff was a competent, trusted employee. He was not a gentleman. He was not landed. He was, from the Paston family's perspective, about as suitable a match for their daughter as the stable boy, and Margery wanted to marry him. We don't know exactly when it started. We don't have love letters, at least not from Margery's side. What we have are the letters her family wrote about the situation, and those letters tell you everything you need to know about what it cost a medieval girl to say no to the plan. Her brother, John Paston III, was furious. In a letter that has survived intact, he described Richard Carl's suit with a contempt that practically lifts off the page. He said that if Margery married Carley, she would be reduced to selling candle and mustard in a shop. Selling candle and mustard. That was the future her own brother saw for her if she married for love instead of advantage. Not poverty exactly, but something worse, in the Paston world view. Insignificance, a life below her station, a fall from which the family name might never recover, which, as expressions of brotherly concern go, tells you rather more about the brother than about the bailiff. Margery's mother, Margaret Paston, was equally opposed. She refused to have Margery in the house. She cut off communication. The family closed ranks against their own daughter with a thoroughness that feels, even across 5 centuries, genuinely cold. And Margery did something remarkable. She held her ground. When the Bishop of Norwich was brought in to mediate, because a disputed marriage was ultimately a matter for the Church, Margery made a declaration that has echoed through the historical record ever since. She said she was bound in her conscience to Richard Carley. She had made promises to him. Those promises, in her mind and under canon law, constituted a valid betrothal. And she would not take them back. Bound in her conscience. Stay with me on that phrase for a moment, because it matters more than it might seem. Margery wasn't just saying she loved someone. She was using the language of canon law, the same law that required consent, the same law that Gratian had compiled 3 centuries earlier to defend her choice. The system that had been used for generations to force girls into marriages they didn't want was being turned, by one girl, into a shield. The Church recognized her claim. Margery and Richard Cal were married. Her family never forgave her. There's no record of a reconciliation. The Paston letters continue for years after Margery's marriage, documenting everything from lawsuits to harvest yields. But Margery herself nearly vanishes from the record. She slips out of the family's correspondence the way she slipped out of their plans, completely and without apology. She died around 1482. She was roughly 34 years old. We don't know the cause. We know almost nothing about her life after the marriage, except that she lived it on her own terms, in a world that made that almost impossibly difficult. I find that quietly remarkable. But let me stay with Margery's story a little longer, because there is a detail about it that almost nobody knows, and it changes the way the whole thing feels. Richard Cal, the bailiff, the wrong person, the man her brother was prepared to see her sell candle and mustard for, wrote her a letter. It survives. It is one of the very few love letters from medieval England that we have, and when you read it, the negotiations and the ledgers and the dowry figures fall away, and what you're left with is just two people who wanted each other in a world that didn't allow it. Tallow wrote that he had been in distress, that he had been separated from her by her family, who were trying to prevent any contact, that he hoped she was well, and that he hoped she hadn't changed her mind, and that if she had, she should tell him honestly, and he would grieve it and let her go. He wrote with a directness and a sadness that feels, across 6 centuries, completely human, not courtly, not formal, just a man who loved someone and was frightened of losing her. Whether Margery received that letter, we don't know for certain. Whether she wrote back, we don't know. What we know is what she said to the Bishop of Norwich when the family brought her before him, hoping that ecclesiastical authority would do what parental pressure hadn't. The bishop asked Margery to account for the words she had spoken to Richard Cal, to reconsider, perhaps, to acknowledge that the match was unsuitable, to give the family a way out. She didn't. She described in the bishop's presence the words she and Richard had exchanged, the specific words of betrothal, and she said, with the bishop and her own family present, that she was bound, that the words had been spoken, that she would not deny them. The bishop, and this is worth noting, was not unsympathetic to her position. He clearly found the situation uncomfortable. He reportedly told her mother, Margaret Paston, that he was sorry for what he was about to record because he knew it would displease the family. And then he recorded it anyway. The church had written the consent requirement, and here, in this bishop's chamber, with a girl who had used it the way it was intended, to choose, the church honoured it. Margaret Paston, the mother, was reported to be in a state of deep distress. She said she would not have Margery in her house. She said that if Margery married this man, she was no daughter of hers. Margery married the man. And now the part I want you to sit with. After the marriage, Richard Calais did not disappear from the Paston records. He continued to work for the Paston family. Not for Margery's side of the family. They had cut her off. For her brothers. Because he was too valuable to dismiss. He was good at his job. He knew the estate. He was competent and reliable, and the brothers, whatever they thought of him personally, could not afford to lose him. So Richard Cal spent years managing the estates of the family that had disowned his wife, working for men who considered his marriage a disgrace, being paid by people who refused to acknowledge that their sister was alive. There's a dark comedy in that, and a kind of quiet persistence. Now, Margery Paston's story is extraordinary because we can read it. The letters survived. The voices are there, preserved in ink that hasn't faded. But she was not the only girl who said no. She was simply the one whose no was written down. Canon law, for all its failures and compromises, did give girls one genuine tool. If you could prove you had freely spoken a betrothal promise to someone, anyone, before the marriage your family arranged, you had a legal argument, not a guarantee, not safety, but an argument, and some girls used it. Others refused in quieter ways. They ran, they hid, they appealed to bishops, to abbesses, to anyone who might intervene. Some entered convents, not because they wanted to become nuns, but because the convent was the only place a girl could go that a husband couldn't follow. The cloister wasn't always a calling. Sometimes it was an escape hatch, and some simply endured. They said yes at the church door because saying no was unthinkable, and then built whatever life they could inside the walls of a marriage they hadn't chosen. These are the girls we know the least about. Their resistance wasn't dramatic. It was internal, daily, invisible. It lived in the way they managed their households, raised their children, carved out small territories of autonomy inside a system designed to leave them none. We'll never know how many there were. The medieval record doesn't keep track of quiet compromises. It keeps track of property and contracts and who owed what to whom. The girls who made the best of it left no letters, no court records, no appeals to bishops. They just lived. And that, in its own way, was its own form of resistance. Before we get to the last story, though, I want to stay in this world for a little longer, because there are things we haven't talked about yet. Things that sit underneath all of the contracts and the ceremonies, things about what happened to girls when they became wives, about the legal framework that governed their lives inside marriage, and about the ways that some women, against very long odds, found room to breathe. The legal term is coverture, and it is, without question, one of the most revealing phrases in the history of English law. Coverture comes from the old French couverture, a covering, a shelter. And under English common law, when a woman married, her legal identity was covered, merged into her husband's. She ceased, in a formal legal sense, to exist as an independent person. She couldn't own property. Any land or goods she brought to the marriage became her husband's. She couldn't sign contracts or sue in court or be sued. She couldn't write a will. She couldn't enter a business agreement. Everything she had, everything she earned, everything she inherited, it all belonged to him, by law, by default, automatically. There were exceptions. Women who'd been granted specific legal exemptions, Pemsol status, could act independently in certain commercial contexts. Wealthy widows could hold property in their own names, and in practice, medieval women exercised far more economic activity than the theory of coverture suggests. They ran businesses, managed estates in their husbands' absences, participated in trade, and sometimes wielded considerable local power. The law and the lived experience were, as usual, different things. But the law shaped the experience in ways that mattered. A woman who was unhappy in her marriage had almost no legal recourse. She couldn't divorce, not really, not in any modern sense. The church allowed annulment under specific conditions, but these were difficult to obtain and required proof of circumstances that were hard to document. Separation was possible, but came with financial consequences that fell almost entirely on the woman. If she left with nothing that was legally hers. The only exit for most medieval women was widowhood, and widowhood is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because for the women who survived it, and many didn't, particularly if they had married young and borne children young, Widowhood was paradoxically the moment of greatest freedom. A widow had her dower rights. Under English law, a widow was entitled to 1/3 of her husband's estate for life. She could manage that estate herself. She could make contracts. She could sue and be sued. She regained, in legal terms, something close to the independent status she had held before marriage. Wealthy widows in medieval England were sometimes extraordinarily powerful. They ran estates. They litigated. They made their own decisions about whether to remarry, and on what terms and to whom. Some chose not to remarry at all, a choice that the law allowed, even if the family and the social world around them pushed hard for it. A wealthy widow was too valuable a prize not to attract pressure. Some of the most capable administrators in medieval England were widows, women who had spent years managing households, learning to run estates in their absent or incompetent husbands' names, and who, once the legal constraints of coverture were lifted by death, suddenly had the freedom to act on what they knew. It's worth sitting with the dark arithmetic of that for a moment. The same system that used girls as pawns in marriage negotiations also, accidentally, created the conditions for some women's power. The younger the bride, the older the husband was likely to be. The older the husband, the more likely he was to die first. And when he died, his young widow, trained, capable, equipped with knowledge she'd spent years accumulating, emerged with property, with status, and with freedom she'd never legally had before. The system that pressed girls down sometimes, through its own internal logic, lifted women up. But the price of that eventual freedom was paid in years, in bodies, in girls who didn't survive early pregnancy, in girls who reached widowhood broken by what they'd endured before it. I want to be specific here, because specificity matters. The medical risks of pregnancy and childbirth in the medieval period were severe for all women, but they were significantly more severe for girls whose bodies were not physically mature. Modern obstetric medicine understands the risks clearly. The pelvis of a 12 or 13-year-old is not fully developed. The bones of the pelvis continue to grow through the mid-teenage years. A girl whose pelvis has not finished growing cannot safely deliver a full-term baby in the way an adult woman can. The risks of obstructed labour, hemorrhage, and injury to the mother are dramatically higher. The medieval world didn't understand the mechanism. They didn't have the language for it, but they could see the consequences. Girls who died in labour, girls who survived labour but never recovered fully, girls who, like Margaret Beaufort, survived but were left unable to have more children. The church noticed. The Canon lawyers who set the age of 12 were trying to draw a line at the edge of physical readiness, even if their understanding of that readiness was incomplete. Some bishops actively discouraged marriage, and especially consummation for very young brides. Some local customs set practical expectations that a girl should not be made to live with her husband until she was older. But the gap between recommendation and reality was, once again, significant. We have one more name I want to give you before we get to the last story. Isabella of France. She was born in 1295, the daughter of the King of France. She married Edward II of England at the age of 12. Edward was 23. The marriage was, by any measure, a political transaction, an alliance between England and France that neither party had chosen. What happened next is a story that historians have argued about for centuries. Edward was, by most accounts, a poor husband and a worse king. His favourites, many lavished with gifts and attention while his wife was sidelined, infuriated the English nobility. Isabella endured this for years. She had 4 children. She performed the role expected of her with considerable public dignity, and then in 1325 she travelled to France on a diplomatic mission and didn't come back. She took a lover, a marcher lord named Roger Mortimer. She raised an army. She invaded England in 1326, deposed her husband, and ruled the country as regent for her teenage son, Edward III. Isabella of France was 31 years old. She had been married at 12, sidelined for years, and had then executed one of the most audacious political reversals in medieval English history. She's sometimes called the She-Wolf of France. The name was meant as an insult. She's been called worse. What she actually was, a girl who'd been handed to a stranger at 12, a girl who spent 19 years learning everything there was to know about the machinery of medieval power, and who, when the moment came, used that knowledge to take control of her own fate. By any measure, she was extraordinary. The system that had used her ended up, quite literally, overthrown by her. And that's the thing about all of these women: Margery Paston, Margaret Beaufort, Isabella of France, the unnamed widows running their estates, the girls in convents who'd chosen a veil over a vow they hadn't made. They were all working within a system they hadn't designed. They were all, in one way or another, shaped by the same machinery, but they were not passive. They were not simply victims of circumstances they couldn't change. They were people, with intelligence and will and sometimes extraordinary capacity for patience, and the world they lived in, for all its cruelties and contradictions, could not entirely contain them. But there is one more story I want to tell you tonight, one that sits at the centre of everything we've talked about: the law, the money, the training, the ceremony, the silence and the cost. It's the story of a girl who was married at 12, who gave birth at 13, and who spent the rest of her life becoming the most powerful woman in England. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and her story is the reason this topic matters, not as history, but as something you can feel. Margaret's life began with a contract, not a love letter, not a christening celebration, a contract. She was born in 1443 into one of the most complicated bloodlines in English history. Her father was John Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset. Her family's claim to the throne was tangled, contested, and, in the political storms of 15th century England, extremely dangerous. She was the only child, and from the moment she drew breath, she was a prize. Not a daughter, a prize. Her father, John Beaufort, died in 1444, when Margaret was barely a year old. He died without a male heir. His title, his claim, his estates, all passed to Margaret in a complicated tangle that lawyers spent years sorting through. She was the sole heir to a fortune and a bloodline that connected, if you followed it carefully enough, through enough twists and generations, to the royal family of England. In the 15th century, with the Wars of the Roses building like a storm on the horizon, that connection was everything, and it was also deeply dangerous. The Beauforts were descended from John of Gaunt and his mistress Catherine Swynford, whom he had later married. Their children had been legitimised by Parliament, but with a clause that some argued excluded the Beaufort line from the succession. Whether this clause applied, whether a Beaufort could ever sit on the throne, was disputed and never resolved. This ambiguity made Margaret Beaufort one of the most politically significant children in England. Her bloodline was a threat, or an opportunity, depending on who was asking. The king took notice. Henry VI made Margaret a royal ward. He took control of her marriage, as the wardship system allowed. He would decide who she married. He would decide who the Beaufort claim passed to. He would manage this dangerous bloodline the way you manage any political liability, carefully, deliberately, with one eye on what it might do if left unattended. Margaret grew up knowing this. She grew up with a mother who could advise and advocate, but who could not resist the king's prerogative when it came to her daughter's marriage. Her mother could write letters. But ultimately, the king's interest was the deciding factor. Her first betrothal came when she was approximately 1 year old. 1. By the time she was 12, a new match had been arranged. Edmund Tudor, the Earl of Richmond. He was the half-brother of King Henry VI. He was 26 years old. She was 12. They married in 1455. Margaret was sent to live with her husband in Wales, a place she didn't know, far from her family, far from anything familiar. She was a child. He was an adult, and within months of the wedding she was pregnant. Edmund Tudor died in November 1456, 3 months before his child was born. He died of plague, in captivity, in his mid-20s. Margaret was 13, widowed, pregnant, and alone in a country that was tearing itself apart in civil war. On the 28th of January 1457, she gave birth to a son. His name was Henry. He would one day become Henry VII, the first Tudor king. The labour nearly killed her. I want you to sit with what that means for a moment. Not as a historical fact, as something real. She was 13 years old, in a castle in Wales, in the middle of January, which in the 15th century in a stone building heated only by fire meant cold in a way that is hard for us to imagine. Her husband had been dead for 3 months. Her family was not with her. The women present were servants of Pembroke Castle, people whose primary loyalty was to the institution, not to the frightened child they were attending. Maternal mortality in medieval childbirth was significant for all women. Historians estimate that somewhere between 1 and 3% of births ended in the mother's death, much higher than modern rates, though the precise figures are difficult to establish from incomplete records. But the risk was dramatically elevated for girls whose bodies had not finished developing. A pelvis that has not completed its growth cannot accommodate a full-term baby in the way an adult can. Obstructed labour, where the baby cannot pass through the birth canal, was a death sentence in a world without surgical intervention. Margaret Beaufort did not die. By whatever combination of luck and physical endurance and skilled attendance, she survived. But Bishop Fisher's account, written years later by a man who knew her well and chose his words with clerical care, makes clear that it was the nearest of things. He wrote that her body had not been ready, that the birth had been, to use the careful language of a 15th century cleric, greatly to her damage. He was describing in the language available to him something that modern medicine would call severe obstetric trauma. And when it was over, when the baby was healthy and the bleeding had stopped and the worst was past, Margaret was left with the consequence, the damage that Fisher obliquely referenced. The damage that meant, despite 3 subsequent marriages spanning decades, she never conceived again. She was 13 years old, and the system, the contracts, the alliances, the political machinery that has been arranging her life since she was an infant, had broken her. But it had not finished with her, not by a long distance. The baby was healthy. Margaret survived, and in the days and weeks after the birth, with the worst behind her, she began to think. She had no husband, she had no father. She was 13 years old, widowed and damaged, in a castle that hadn't been hers to begin with, and she had a son with a claim to the throne of England, however tangled and dangerous that claim might be. She made a choice that tells you everything you need to know about her. She chose a guardian for herself and Henry, her late husband's brother, Jasper Tudor, who was loyal and capable and committed to the Lancastrian cause. She placed her son in Jasper's protection, and she began the long work of surviving. The next few years were not quiet. The Wars of the Roses, the conflict between the Lancastrian and Yorkist claimants to the throne, grew more violent. The Lancastrian cause that Henry Tudor represented was suppressed. In 1461, the Yorkists took control of England. Edward IV became king, and Henry Tudor, at the age of 4, became a political liability, a child whose existence was a potential threat to the new regime. He was sent into exile in Brittany. Margaret stayed in England. They would not see each other again for 14 years. 14 years. Think about that. A mother and her only child separated for 14 years by politics and war and ocean. Margaret couldn't reach him. She could write letters when the diplomatic situation allowed it. She could send money when she could arrange it, but she could not be there, could not see him grow, couldn't know from year to year whether he was well or whether the Yorkists had finally decided that an exiled Lancastrian claimant was too dangerous to leave alive. She was kept in England, remarried by the political situation's requirements. Her second marriage to Henry Stafford was, by the evidence of the letters, not unhappy. Henry Stafford seems to have been a decent man, genuinely fond of her. She was still very young when they married, and in some ways this marriage, which she had more input into choosing than the first, was a quieter chapter. But through all of it, the thread to her son never broke. She tracked his situation. She cultivated allies who could help him. She maintained connections across the political divide. The Staffords had Yorkist sympathies, which actually gave her cover, gave her access to people and information she might not have reached from the purely Lancastrian side. She was learning the game, quietly, methodically, with the patience of someone who'd been told all her life to be patient. Henry Stafford died in 1471 of wounds sustained at the Battle of Barnet. Margaret was widowed for the second time. She was 28 years old. She married again, Thomas Stanley, a powerful nobleman with excellent political instincts and connections to both sides of the conflict. It was the best possible marriage she could have made at that moment strategically. Whether it was anything other than strategic is unclear. The historical record doesn't give us much of Margaret's interior life in this period. What it gives us is her actions, and her actions, across the 1470s and into the 1480s, were those of a woman who was running a long game. She communicated with her son in Brittany through a network of trusted intermediaries. She worked with like-minded nobles who were growing increasingly dissatisfied with the Yorkist rule. She cultivated her relationship with Elizabeth Woodville, the former Yorkist queen, and helped arrange a crucial agreement. Henry Tudor would marry Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth of York, if he could take the throne. This would unite the two warring claims. It would end the wars. It would be the deal that made a king. Margaret made that deal. She brokered it herself from inside England, while nominally loyal to the Yorkist regime. The man she was married to, Thomas Stanley, was himself a Yorkist supporter. She operated in the spaces between loyalties, in the gaps in surveillance, in the letters and meetings that could be arranged without attracting attention. The summer of 1485. Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army. He marched through the country Margaret knew so well, the same Welsh landscape where she'd given birth to him 28 years earlier. She could not be there. She was in England, at court, the wife of a Yorkist lord, with no outward sign that she was the person who had made this invasion possible. On the 22nd of August, 1485, at a field near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, two armies met, and when it was over, Richard III was dead, Henry Tudor was king, Margaret Beaufort had won. The story goes that when she received the news, she wept, not with sadness, with the release of something that had been wound tight inside her for 28 years, the relief of a woman who had worked towards something for so long that the moment of achievement felt, perhaps, slightly unreal. She wept, and then she got to work. What Margaret Beaufort did with the rest of her life is one of the most extraordinary stories in English history. She took the system that had used her, the contracts, the alliances, the political chess, and she mastered it. She didn't escape the game. She became better at it than anyone who had ever played against her. With her only son on the throne, Margaret became a figure of enormous influence. She had her own household, her own income, her own political network. She signed her letters Margaret R., Margaret Regina. Not Queen, she wasn't Queen. But the initial told you everything about where she believed she stood. She used that position. She founded Christ's College at Cambridge. She founded St. John's College at Cambridge. She endowed schools, sponsored scholars, funded translations of important texts into English so that knowledge could circulate beyond the Latin literate elite. The girl whose education had consisted of spinning and obedience, and how to pour wine correctly, became one of the most significant patrons of education in English history. She also, toward the end of her life, showed what she had learned about the system from the inside. When negotiations began for the marriage of her granddaughter, another Margaret Tudor, to King James IV of Scotland, Margaret Beaufort intervened. She advised her son, Henry VII, not to let the girl marry too young. She warned that it could injure her health. Injure her health. 3 words. Quiet. Diplomatic. The kind of phrase you use at court when you mean something far more devastating than the words suggest. The word she knew. She knew because it had happened to her, because her body still carried the evidence of what marrying at 12 had cost. Because she was 60 years old, and she'd never had another child, and she still remembered. Margaret Beaufort died on the 29th of June, 1509. She was 66 years old. She had outlived her son by 2 months. Henry VII died in April of that same year. She had spent her final years consolidating the Tudor dynasty, managing the transition of power to her grandson, Henry VIII, and continuing to build the educational institutions that were her deepest legacy. The girl who had been a contract became a dynasty. The girl whose body was broken by a system she hadn't chosen spent her life building things that system could never touch. Colleges, scholarships, knowledge that would survive for centuries after the contracts had turned to dust. And she warned them. She looked at her granddaughter and said, "Not yet. Wait. Let her grow, because I know what happens when you don't." They listened. Margaret Tudor was 13 when she married James IV of Scotland, still young by our standards as by any humane standard, but a year older than her grandmother had been, a year that, in the brutal arithmetic of medieval childbirth, still mattered. It's not a satisfying resolution. 1 year. A woman who had spent 60 years accumulating political influence, who had toppled regimes and founded colleges and brokered the deal that put her son on the throne, and the best she could do for the next generation was 1 year. But that's the nature of incremental change. It doesn't come all at once. It comes in twos. in small concessions wrung from systems that have no interest in conceding anything, in voices, usually women's voices, saying quietly into rooms full of power, "Not yet. Wait. Let her grow." Margaret Beaufort knew she couldn't dismantle the system. She'd been inside it long enough to understand that it was held up by forces far larger than any individual could move. Economics, custom, law, the accumulated weight of centuries. She couldn't change those things with one conversation, one letter, one intervention. But she could say the words. She could use the authority she had spent decades building to say, "These 2 years matter. This girl's body matters. Let her grow." And they listened. That's not nothing. Across the centuries, a woman speaking from her own broken experience, making a small space for the girl who came after her. That's not nothing at all. There's something I want to hold for a moment before we move toward the close. Not the politics, not the power. The fact that a woman who had been given no choices spent her entire life ensuring that the girls who came after her would have at least one more choice than she'd had. She couldn't give them freedom. The world she lived in didn't have that to give. But she could give them 2 years. She could found colleges so that women's minds might be educated. She could build institutions that would carry, long after she was gone, the implicit argument that women's minds were worth investing in. In a world that had turned her into a contract at the age of 1, she died leaving behind 2 of the most prestigious educational institutions in England. Institutions that still stand, that still bear her name, that still educate people, including women now, including people from every background, including people whose names and faces Margaret Beaufort could not have imagined, every year, every term, every day. The girl who had been a contract became a legacy. That's not a small thing. Across 500 years, it's not a small thing at all. And here is something I want to tell you before we go any further towards sleep. Because this story doesn't end with Margaret Beaufort, and it doesn't end in the 15th century. Things changed, slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, but they changed. The Reformation, which swept through England in the 16th century under Henry VIII, Margaret Beaufort's grandson of all people, changed the relationship between marriage and the church. When England broke from Rome, the Protestant reformers took a new look at the institution of marriage. They rejected the Catholic view of marriage as a sacrament. And this had a surprising effect. If marriage wasn't a religious mystery, they argued, it was a civil contract, something that could be discussed, reformed, regulated differently. The consent requirement didn't disappear. If anything, Protestant reformers strengthened their commitment to it in theory. But the entire ecosystem around it began to shift. The humanist movement of the 15th and 16th centuries, the intellectual revolution that rediscovered classical learning and placed human beings at the centre of inquiry, had its own effect on girls. Humanist thinkers wrote about the education of women, not in the way the medieval household training worked, not spinning and obedience and how to pour wine, but actual intellectual education. Reading, writing, Latin, history, rhetoric. Thomas More educated his daughters alongside his sons. His daughter, Margaret Roper, became one of the most learned women in England, a scholar of Latin who corresponded with Erasmus, the most celebrated intellect in Europe, who praised her learning publicly. More believed that women's minds were equal to men's, and that the only thing preventing women from demonstrating that equality was access to education. He was ahead of his time. Most of his contemporaries were not persuaded. But the idea was in the air, and ideas, once they're in the air, are very difficult to put back. The Reformation also gradually changed the economic logic of marriage. As the feudal system eroded, as land ownership became less about military obligation and more about commerce and property, the calculus that had made daughters into debts began to shift. The wardship system, that extraordinary machinery for extracting profit from orphaned children, came under increasing criticism from legal thinkers and reformers who could see it for what it was. It was abolished in 1660, finally, replaced by a system of inheritance and guardianship that was somewhat more protective of children's interests. Somewhat. The progress was real, but it was not fast, and it was not complete. Girls continued to be married young in England through the 17th and 18th centuries. The legal minimum age of 12 for girls didn't change in English law until 1929, within living memory of people alive today. The full legal age of marriage in the UK didn't reach 18 until 2022. Let me say that again. 16 was the minimum legal age for marriage in the United Kingdom until 2022. With parental consent, you could be married at 16 in England until 3 years ago. The machinery Margaret Beaufort pushed back against in 1503 took 519 more years to be fully dismantled. That's not a comfortable number, but it's the honest one. And around the world, the story is still being written. Child marriage, formally defined as marriage before the age of 18, remains legal in some form in over 100 countries. It affects millions of girls every year. The specific mechanisms are different from the medieval English system. The context is different, the language is different, but the fundamental structure, a family making a decision about a girl's body and her future, for economic or social reasons with or without her meaningful consent, is the same. The medieval story and the modern story are not separate stories. They're the same story in different costumes. And that's why this history matters. Not as a curiosity, not as a piece of reassuring evidence that things used to be worse, as a lens, as a way of understanding a pattern that didn't end in 1400 or 1660 or 1929 or even 2022. There are girls right now, tonight, who are living versions of everything I've described, not in castles, not with dowries written in Latin, but with the same essential logic that their marriage is a decision for someone else to make, for reasons that have nothing to do with what they want. I don't say that to send you to sleep heavy with it. I say it because the people who listen to this kind of history late at night, who follow the stories of Margery Paston and Margaret Beaufort and Isabella of France, who care enough to stay with a long story until the end, those are the people most likely to keep asking the question, why did they do it? And then, why are we still doing it? You've been with me for a while now. The room around you is probably darker than when we started. The pillow is warmer. The story is winding down, the way stories do when the important parts have been told and what's left is the quiet that comes after. So let me bring this somewhere gentle, somewhere you can rest. Everything we've talked about tonight, the law, the money, the wardship, the training, the church door, the bedding, the girls who said no and the girls who couldn't, all of it comes back to one thing. A world that looked at a 12-year-old girl and saw, not a person, but a problem to be solved, a contract to be fulfilled, a debt to be settled. And the hardest part of that isn't the cruelty, it's the logic. It's the way every piece of the system made sense to the people inside it. The father wasn't a villain. He was a man who loved his daughter and believed he was securing her future. The church wasn't indifferent. It wrote rules that tried genuinely to protect her. The groom wasn't always a monster. Sometimes he was just another person caught in the same machinery. The system didn't need villains. It just needed everyone to keep doing what was expected. And most people did. But not all of them. Margery Paston said no. Margaret Beaufort said, "Not to my granddaughter." And somewhere, in every generation, a girl looked at the contract on the table and thought, "This is not right." Even if she couldn't say it, even if she never did, the fact that she thought it matters. The fact that we're still thinking about it, lying here in the dark centuries later, that matters too. Let yourself settle now. Let the weight of the covers do what it's meant to do. Feel the warmth of the bed beneath you, the softness of the pillow against your cheek. The room is quiet. The story is ending. But the girls are still there. In the records, in the letters, in the margins of history, a hand on a folded contract perfectly still. A voice in a bishop's chamber saying, "I am bound." A woman at the end of her life writing, "Let her grow." They're still there, and you've kept them company tonight. Let your awareness of the room come back slowly, not all the way. You don't have to be fully here, just enough to feel the surface you're lying on, the weight of the blanket, the specific temperature of the air against your face. These are real things, solid, present things that exist in this moment, not in the 15th century. You are here. The room is quiet. The night is long. Let your breathing slow, not deliberately, not as an exercise. Just notice it happening, the way you'd notice a candle flame settling after a gust of wind has passed. The flame flickers, wobbles, finds its shape again. The breath is the same. It finds its own pace. It always does. The contract on the table, the ink dry now, the candle beside it, burning low. The room smells of tallow and parchment. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers. Not flames anymore. Just a soft orange glow that makes the shadows gentle. The kind of light that makes everything look a little softer, a little further away. The girl's hand resting on the folded contract, perfectly still. She doesn't know that 600 years later someone will be lying in a warm bed thinking about her. She doesn't know that her story, fragments of it, details of it, the shape of the world she lived in, will be told to someone who can't sleep, who needs company, who finds something comforting in the presence of the past. She just knows this room, this candle, this contract. And we know her room too now. The cold stone, the fire, the smell of the tallow, the weight of the thing on the table. You're still here. The story has been told. The voices have said what they needed to say. And now the room is quiet and the light is low, and the contract on the table is just a piece of parchment. Just ink on vellum. Just something that happened a long time ago, in a world that was trying its best and getting it wrong in ways it couldn't see. The way all worlds do, including ours. That's not a frightening thought if you hold it gently. The world has always been imperfect. It has always had people in it who pushed against what was wrong, even when the pushing cost them everything. That's how history works. That's how people work. Let that settle down through you now, the weight of it, and the release of it. The understanding that the world has always been imperfect, has always been a mixture of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary grace, has always had people in it who pushed against what was wrong, even when the pushing cost them everything. Margaret Beaufort, Margaret Roper, Margery Paston, Isabella of France, the girls whose names we don't know, the widows who managed their estates, the nuns who chose the veil, the peasant women who brewed the ale and raised the children and held the households together. They were all here once, real and present and particular. And now they're in the past, which is also a kind of presence, a kind of company. You carry them with you now, just lightly, just as weight, the way a good meal sits in you, warmly, comfortably, settled. The fire settles, the embers shift, a soft sound, almost like breathing. Let your muscles go. You've been awake for a long time. The body knows what to do now. It's been waiting. Just let the tension leave, from your jaw, from your shoulders, from your hands. Let the bed hold you. The room is warm, the night is long, and you are here, and you are safe, and nothing needs to be decided tonight. Nothing needs to be done. The contracts are all signed or unsigned, the decisions made or unmade, the history exactly as it was. Nothing you do in the next few hours will change any of it. All that's left is sleep. The candle burns lower, the shadows soften. The breath comes slowly, slowly. Let the images drift now. The cold stone, the folded parchment, the garland of rosemary, the sound of pipes at a wedding, the spindle dropping, clattering on a stone floor. A mother disappearing around a bend in a road, a bishop's chamber, and a voice. I am bound. A woman at 60 writing 3 quiet words on a piece of paper. Let them drift. They'll be there in the morning if you want them. They'll be in the books, in the archives, in the margins of history where they've always been, waiting for the next person who needs company in the dark. But for now, just the warmth, just the quiet, just the slow, steady glow of a fire that has done its work and is resting now, the way you are resting now. The glow softens. The room fills with it. Not brightness, just warmth. The particular warmth that you feel when sleep is almost there. The edges of things going gentle. The girl's hand on the contract. Still. Your hand on the pillow. Still. The breath, moving slowly, in and out and in. The room is very quiet now. Rest. The light is fading, very gently, like a candle at the end of a long night. Let it go. Let it fade. You're safe. You're warm. The story is told. Sleep now.